I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over the priors, coming into the Russian-Georgia war from a European defense and security standpoint. The purpose of the series, of course, is to get everybody a sense of how Europe's evolving its defense and security, and ultimately its foreign policy, and then the individual countries, how they're handling their shift in postures as the Russian invasion, and then just prior to the Russian invasion, as the shift in all the security challenges that have occurred in Europe for the last decade plus. And so one of the, I would say, largest events prior to the initial Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the large-scale migrant crisis in the 2010s was the Russian-Georgia war. And I think one of the reasons it's important to understand why that would be meaningful is how Georgia saw itself and how Europeans saw Georgia, and how Europe has worked to extend, at least economically and in some cases politically and socially, Europeanness through at least Western Eurasia. And it's been selective. And this was part of a larger, broader push in the 90s. You saw it with Turkey. You saw it with Georgia, at times with Azerbaijan. Armenia has always been sort of left off, primarily because of not it being a full Russian satellite state, but about as close to that as you could be. And so Europe has always tended to just treat the Armenians as a state relationship more just in pure economic terms. But Georgia was different, and a lot of it came down to its domestic politics in the 2000s. It made a very aggressive shift into becoming pro-European and wanting to become a member of all of the mainline European institutions, or everyone it could get its hands on, and partnering, especially after 9/11, with any European or American or other partners that were conducting operations in Afghanistan and throughout Central Asia. And so Russia, or to back up, there has always been a conflicted or an open to debate territorial dispute between what is Russia, what is Georgia, what is part of the different Transcaucasus, and that's an area called Ossetia, and exactly. And north and south, west and east, there are different variants. There at times were almost warlords that were operating in those areas as proxies of both Georgians and Russians. And there was a short war, which occurred in August 2008. And obviously the Russians back then, were a different force, and the Georgians also were a different force compared to the Ukrainians. And that war didn't really last very long. It was basically a rout, and the Russians basically imposed a settlement which allowed that region to become pro-Russian. And at this point, it's still an open conflict area, which has been part of the Russian strategy, because most institutions in the world have clauses that if you want to join them, you can't have an open border conflict. And so Russia has leveraged that effectively, as others have, the Chinese, other large state powers, so that they've reduced the ability of these smaller states to have more freedom of movement. And so this event became somewhat seismic because of the degree of cooperation the Georgians had with European institutions at that point, including their their leadership and the types of investments that were starting to occur in Georgia. And so, in essence, what the Europeans attempted to do was to play negotiator between the Russians and Georgia, to basically reduce that conflict from expanding. And of course, the French and the Europeans ultimately were led in that negotiation by Sarkozy, who also held the presidency of the EU Council. And so that was really a kind of critical moment of European power politics, or trying to insert itself into those power politics. The US stood pretty far outside of this conflict because just like in Ukraine, a border conflict with the Russians, the US tries to not, in general, be a major party to that. I think Ukraine, as we've talked in the past, has evolved as a different type of conflict. But that gives you kind of the background of this conflict and its repercussions through Europe. I think are kind of critical because they actually gave the Europeans this sense that they could mediate their way through all of the contested conflicts that would go on further with Russia, whether it was with Estonia, whether it was with Ukraine, Kazakhstan, others, and there's been more than a dozen really. And until obviously this large scale war with Ukraine has sort of shifted that sense of how Europeans should operate with Russia on the international scene. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
There were a couple of questions I actually had for this approach. The Europeans seem to have wanted to selectively choose, for example, you said Georgia and Azerbaijan to a greater degree than, say, Armenia and Belarus, let's say. I'm curious as to why there was so much focus on Georgia in the early aughts, especially since the Abkhazia conflict was already, quote, resolved as a frozen conflict by 1991. So that would have already touched that borders issue.
Sure. I mean, I think there's something we need to sort of always recognize with the European Union, is that the European Union tends to benefit, and I would say aggressively support any outside actors who are attempting to shift their behavior to meet European norms. And Georgia at that time, relative to that time, right? It's all relative to that period that we're talking about in the early 2000s. We're making enormous strides, strides that were that you could today compare to what the Balkans are doing. And I would say they were on par to what many in Central Europe were doing also. And especially the French tend to have a more expeditionary foreign policy, politically, economically, socially, even militarily. And with the French, you can find a pretty willing actor if you're an outside party that is attempting to project your Europeanness, as you've seen with very recently with the ascension of in the Balkans, with Croatia just in the last week, and the support that really the whole Balkan region has had from the French, right? So I think ultimately Georgia's relationship with the EU had more to do with a combination of their behavior, and it was committed, it was real. The Georgians really were pushing into supporting European institutions, including NATO, or as much of NATO as was allowable by the NATO parties, and all those European institutions. Whereas if this conflict had never happened, I think by this point, Georgia would probably be either in that final member candidacy space or a member of the EU at this point. And so what the Russians were able to do is freeze that completely. And I think the reason that's important is I think it did create a feedback loop amongst Russians that this was an effective strategy. And it was until it wasn't.
Right.
And I think that's how this always tends to work. So
Yeah, I think we have a comment that says that Georgia is not in Europe. There is a technicality that part of the Caucasus mountain range, the top of that mountain range, is considered the effective border between Europe and Asia. And there is a small part of Georgia, actually within Abkhazia, that crosses that line. So Georgia is technically like 5% or 6%, something like that, in the European continent, and that makes it eligible for EU membership.
well, and the thing we have to recognize, or we should try to, is not take our present 2022 understanding of Southern European and, let's say, Southern Western Eurasian politics, economics, social and military conditions, but look at it from 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, 22, 23, 24 years ago, it was looking, and my contention is they wouldn't have yet been in, but they would have been the biggest non-member at this point. That would have been right on the edge. Is that Turkey was in a progression of starting to go through becoming a member of the EU. Ultimately, a combination of internal events in Turkey and external events in countries like France, and I'd say to some degree in Germany and the EU prevented that. But we shouldn't underestimate that. At the time there were, I think it's 34 then. I think it's now like 41 different
Copenhagen
criteria that you have to meet. And the Turkey was, I think, up to like 22 or 24 of those, which is, pretty substantial, right? I mean, especially for a state the size of Turkey, right? It's not Macedonia, it's not Slovenia. And so going into that, or during that 2000s and going into the 2000s from the 90s, there was a momentum, let's say, in this expansion of Europe, which isn't there anymore, but that was there then. And that was a huge influence because Russia was not part of that. A lot of that was their own choice. And a big chunk of it also was a lot of the Eastern European countries not feeling comfortable with Russia being a positive actor, not a malign actor, which I think they're somewhat proven correctly on that one. And so that was the context of where Georgia was at that point. I do believe Georgia's doing a reboot, and I think, if I'm just prognosticating, they're really going to make another run at this. It's going to be a softer run. It'll be sort of lessons learned, but that was something that was very real going into that conflict, which of course, froze everything, which was obviously to Russia's benefit, not to Georgia's benefit, and obviously changed enormous amounts of the power dynamics in how the EU refocused its energy. And in some ways, one of the reasons it took its foot off the gas in the Balkans until very recently was because of the Georgia conflict. Because in essence, especially with Serbia, but then other states like Bulgaria and Romania, which technically aren't necessarily part of the Balkans, but that's sort of debatable from whatever side you're on. That slowed that whole progression down, and I still believe, sort of to this day, it still does. And if anyone's followed it in the last week, Croatia was able to come into the EU. It's a big deal. Romania and Bulgaria are not full-blown members yet, with all of the benefits and the euro, and then all of the investment and support, et cetera. So that's I believe in some ways a blast radius from this conflict 15 years later.
Yeah, I feel like this is very similar to the Daedalus Icarus story. Where the European Union, we saw that they had influence in the Afghanistan conflict, but that was primarily the United States. This seems to be the furthest extent away from Western Europe, where Germany, France, the other major members of the Western European Union are based, that they're trying to have an impact, and that impact sort of was muddled because of the Russian intervention
That's
that was
exactly
so
right.
successful
That's
in
exactly
South
right.
Ossetia.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, so and the Germans have had a long-running connection to this to the long-running conflict, which I know we did a presentation on a couple 18 months ago or so, which I think was lost, right? The Georgian Abkhazian.
No,
Oh, that was there.
no, we never did Georgia
I
Abkhazia.
thought we did that.
We did Nagorno-Karabakh.
Oh, we did Nagorno-Karabakh. You're right. You're right. And so so the Germans have had a fairly continuous relationship to how NATO and the Bucharest declarations, which promised various forms of membership to Georgia, Ukraine, and ultimately to some or potential Balkan a relationship, which many have argued were triggers, for Russian conduct, both in Georgia, later Estonia, Ukraine, pretty much everywhere that they had reach in the former Soviet Union, post end of the Cold War. And the reason this is important is this ties into what was being developed, which is in some ways what I was talking about earlier, which is what was called the ENP, which is the European neighborhood policy. So this was, obviously by today's standards, this looks somewhat naive, as everything always does when there's a massive conflict that explodes. But at the time, most of the actors involved all viewed it as a set of positives that were progressing many of these states towards modernity, towards modern economics, towards integrated social systems. And I would say, if Russia wasn't a malign actor in this, most of those states would have had some degree of ascension into Europe at this point. Maybe not full-blown EU membership with the euro, and to the point that even Russia would have had probably another, there would have been a special policy built around Russia by this point, assuming they would have been more supportive. And I'm not arguing that was a fait accompli, and that Russia's perspective relative to where they were as a authoritarian security state didn't see this as a threat. They did. But if they were a different actor, their benefits to this would have been quite substantial, actually. And if you look at, and we see the energy politics of it today, you can only imagine if Russia was in a more collegial atmosphere, they would have almost a Saudi type relationship with Europe at this point that would really be unbreakable economically and socially. So, yep.
Yeah, just sort of my question here. How much teeth does the NATO Bucharest Declaration have in terms of showing the aspirations of NATO and then later on of the European Union?
I think the best way to think of this is that there was a combination of sort of naive opportunism by all the parties. And then at the same time, it was also a very, I'm not saying it only carried as much weight as the paper that it was printed on, but at the end of the day, these tend to be extremely immature initiatives, states. They don't have a lot of infrastructure, as you can even see today with a full-scale war going on between Ukraine and Russia, how absolutely either difficult, impossible it is for most European states to even sufficiently support the Ukrainians. So the idea that you could have a declaration which was going to establish really at most a bunch of high-level, sort of talking shops which would lead over time to really more economic and sort of social cohesion, because ultimately that's the European project, right? It's not a security project. It's a security project through economic and social cohesion. And I think that's the least underreported area aspect to this whole challenge that Russia's had with modern Europe, is that the European project as a social economic cohesion project seeks to leverage that as its security, or a big chunk, let's say, a big down payment of its security infrastructure. It's not the other way around, right? It's not having large militaries that are choosing to centralize command and then forming a bulwark against outsiders with a cordon layered of defense and security. It's the exact opposite of that. And I think ultimately what Russia has attempted to work against is that social economic cohesion. And you could see it in the actions in this conflict today with Ukraine. They're not launching strikes against other non-NATO actors, maybe cyber, but that's sort of always going on. They're going after the economic and and a big chunk of the social cohesion, because that's the threat. The threat is that economic social cohesion. And ultimately, these type of declarations or neighborhood policies were really trust building exercises to step people through these. Europeans are famous for having dozens of step ladders, right? It's not one big step and you get to join and get all the benefits of the EU. It's 50 or 100 steps. If you're lucky, it's 25.
And each of those steps has a sort of integration mechanism.
That's right. And an enormous amount of that integration, I would argue all of it, is economic and social cohesion, right? There's only a tiny number that you could argue are military. And at this point, I don't even view them as military. They're almost security police, border, human trafficking, type, drug
enforcement
enforcement level issues, right? And so that
I think that actually goes in pretty well to a question that we've gotten, which is what's the legal relationship between the EU and NATO? And it's going to sound a little blasé if I say it, but there's really no legal relationship between the two. NATO is a military alliance whose fundamental goal, as we've explored in the earlier episodes in the series, is for the defense of Europe against an Eastern threat, primarily Russia, but it could be another communist state, or as we saw with September 11th, against Islamic jihadists.
That's right.
But the European Union is an economic, social, and political integration across the continent of Europe. And so one of the things that we've been discussing, and Aaron's really taken his time in episodes 4, 5, and 6, I believe, of the series, was the Western European Union and other defense organizations that the Europeans tried to develop outside of NATO within the context of what would become the European Union. And by and large, these defensive arrangements and agreements don't seem to have long-term viability without the United States as an outside actor.
That's right. That's exactly
NATO
right.
Provides.
And that's basically it. I mean, if we're going to look at it in its modern, so NATO is a very unique institution because of its construction in the late 40s, early 50s, was to act as a Western security alliance that leveraged the United States as, in essence, the defense in depth. And I think it's very important to understand this. NATO does not have in all of its alliance doctrine, policy, declarations, articles, anything that references offensive warfare and capability. It's a fundamentally defensive alliance. It's actually it's one of the only reasons it could be even established, is that the states that were members of it, going back to the 40s and 50s, demanded that it become only a defensive alliance. And so, and others can argue, well, that's just language, blah, blah, blah. But that's not true because of the way NATO is like the EU, in that it requires unanimity in action. So those members have to vote, and people could argue, well, the U.S. could strong arm them. I mean, you could say that in theory, but in reality, if you're talking about the Dutch being strong-armed, using this as an example, and somehow sending 5,000 Dutch to go, over a cliff, there's not going to be a government anywhere that's going to sign up for that. I mean, that government wouldn't last the day,
Well,
basically.
no, I mean, I think this is actually some of the push and pull between the European Union and NATO in terms of their disagreements in terms of function and form, right? You have a situation with NATO where the only defense commitment that you're making is a defensive defense commitment. So, and remember, NATO was created in the late 40s, early 50s. This is when Britain and France were still imperial powers. This is when you still had the Cold War and those countries being entangled in the nationalism crises. By the way, plug in for my Middle Eastern history series, because we're going to be covering that next year on Thursdays at 7 p.m. Eastern time. But you're going to have this sort of situation that a lot of the non-imperial European powers, let's say the Netherlands, Italy, they don't want to be dragged into these horror shows of Britain and France trying to defend the Suez Canal.
And that was a seismic event that most people don't fully appreciate, is that the Suez was really the new red line of the new NATO. So the United States was very clear that it was not going to support any imperial ambitions directly, either as an actor or indirectly through NATO. And the UK and the French attempted first to go through NATO and were rejected, and then attempted to go to the US separately. Directly. Yeah, exactly, directly, and were obviously rejected, pretty conclusively, and then decided on their own to mount one of history's great genius projects, and failed pretty miserably at this. And it really forced an enormous shift in behavior in NATO post-Suez that then got locked in during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So you really have this modern NATO until the end of the Cold War that was really christened through Suez and through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and which was this hyper defensive, really a defense in depth for both combination of conventional and a response. And it's one of the reasons that NATO does not have a set of directives or articles concerning nuclear weapons, because the two full independent nuclear powers in Europe, the French and the Brits, the others have sharing agreements, but the U.S. governs those sharing agreements 100%. So there's no other actor that could step in and manipulate those. I mean, in theory, could the Brits and French try? Who knows? But that's never gonna happen. But so the nuclear, the strategic and tactical nuclear defense of Europe was made independent of NATO, kept as a national, kept in the national realm between the UK, the French, and the United States independently, and the sharing agreement through the United States and all the other actors, meaning bombers landing on bases or missile defense, et cetera.
No, and I think this really highlights the functional difference, as I was saying, between the NATO as a defensive organization and the 2008 Russia-Georgian war. It shows the EU as an offensive organization, not in a military sense, but in an economic, political, and social sense.
That's right.
That they're trying to bring more members into the EU, either directly through membership or indirectly through treaties, through accession agreements, things like that, that increase the size, scale, and scope of the European Union, where we're not seeing that with the way that NATO performs.
That's right. And the largest area that's happening in right now is in the MENA region. To plug your series.
Yeah, the Euro-Mediterranean project.
That's right. Exactly. So there's and we're not there yet, but I think I'm not going to be shocked this decade if you don't see pretty robust European initiatives that eventually evolve Turkey, Israel, GCC, et cetera. At the same time, the rest of the MENA countries become, let's say, Balkan ready over the next 10 to 20 years to begin, I think, ultimately some of their ascension projects. I think there's, if I'm betting, I'm not going to be shocked by the 2040s if one of the North African countries is probably Morocco is in the EU. That's not going to, or whatever other almost EU, baby, small E, big U, right? That basically becomes pro forma. And that is where Europe is investing its, you could say, its expansion and almost social, political, economic, expeditionary, strategy. And they've expanded north, Iceland, and they've expanded, and they're expanding south. They've expanded east. Obviously running up against Russia. I do think big picture, there will have to be a substantial reckoning post Erdogan, whenever that day comes, the next, 5 to 20 years. I think he's about 71 now, right? Something like that.
Yeah,
around there. So I probably doesn't have more than about a decade. And I do think you could see Turkey on a it'll be a new track. They won't go down the same path again. I think that was, if it had worked, great, but ultimately, when you look back, you were asking for an enormous amount of political and social and economic change to happen to a very large place very quickly. And to be blunt, there wasn't a lot of European support in doing it. And I think, when this happens again, it's going to be much more moderated and sort of modulated. But Turkey is going to lean, I think, pretty hard post Erdogan into Europe. It's kind of a no-brainer, really, if you look at the next level of Turkish development.
Yeah, it's not like Russia can be a reasonable ally for them.
No. At this point, yeah. And China, for all of its sort of economic benefits transactionally, the distances and the types of relationships it's going to have are fairly transactional, very much like you would have with Saudi Arabia typically, if you're out of region, which is going to be around energy. It's going to be around a handful of commodities. It's not enough to act as a full strategic partner where you have.
Yeah, and China has very little power of projection, even though they have the military might, they just don't have the means of moving it.
They don't.
So speaking of the strategy, because we talked about that expansion of social, economic, and political capital, and that's really where this comes in the European neighborhood policy. So you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So ultimately, Europe will rebrand these initiatives. They're actually a genius. I mean, you could argue they're almost a modern consumer goods company in the way that they will recycle a go-to-market around a particular initiative. But ultimately, the European neighborhood policy is about conveying peripheral support for economic, social, and through that security benefits, without having a membership plan. So it's almost like a club member. It's like being able to join a fancy club, but as a bronze member, not as a platinum, diamond, or gold member. And it tends to almost allow both parties to test everything out and gain some of those advanced benefits for Europe, right? So a big party to this now is the social cohesion components. So if you're joining in these neighborhood type programs, you have to agree to certain behaviors, socially, legally, politically, when it comes to rights, when it comes to support of different communities, when it comes to different social cohesion policies, when it comes to migration, et cetera. And you're sort of calibrated up this ladder proportionally based on those. And so it is an instrument of European power through arguably social cohesion. You're really sort of trading the social cohesion for the economic access. I mean, that's ultimately what's happening. And I think a lot of states are in various, a lot of stable states, let's say, are in degrees of transition now in the modern world, and they're looking for when they look out and they see their choices between their regional actors, between China, US, Russia, and Europe, they see a pretty good deal more often than not with the European package. The Europeans, most states, their largest concern is obviously their survival when it comes to their own security, their own military, their own ability to defend their borders and or project. And these European policies don't tend to run up against that unless that state is hyper aggressive. If that state is hyper aggressive to its minority populations or to other regional actors, then they're going to run afoul. And obviously those states know that going in, the Europeans know that going in, everyone knows that going in. So they don't tend to, they sort of self-select. Yeah, they tend to self-select, really, to be honest. That's why you're seeing this big shift in the Balkans. I think the shift in the Balkans now is enormous. The shift of what you've seen, what's going on between Serbia, Croatia, even Kosovo, and its degrees of resolution, Macedonia or North Macedonia, even Greece, and I could see. I mean, it sounds crazy, but over the next, especially post Erdogan, and eventually a future Greek government, I could see not a reconciliation, but let's say getting out of this sort of hostility phase. And I think that's going to be a big part of Turkey having a greater ability to exist in Europe, is to not be a hostile actor towards Greece, because
or its own minorities.
Or its own minorities. But I do think the Greek issue is even larger, primarily because Greek has been party either immediately or second or third wave to almost every single European institution that's been constructed the last 70 years. So, they, in some ways, punch above their weight in relative form, to the point that during the Euro crisis, Greece was bailed out repeatedly. You didn't see Iceland bailed out or Ireland bailed out, right? And there's nothing to say that's anything wrong with Iceland or the Irish. Is to point out that that the Greek relationship to the European politics is very strong. And actually, speaking of that, there was news in the last 48 hours, which came in that yeah, exactly, that one of the 14 vice presidents on the European Council was arrested, and at this point, several dozen other aides and former members, mostly on the Social Democratic left side, almost all, I think, exclusively part of some type of large graft campaign by the Qataris to gain, it seems like, a version of the neighborhood policy, but with visa benefits, like at pretty sophisticated, like basically Schengen level visa benefits. So I think this case is going to probably blow pretty far open, because I can't imagine this is the only actor trying this strategy. And I think once you start pulling on this string, we're going to see quite a bit. And the reason I'm bringing that up is that that was a former Greek member of parliament and a senior political leader, and to the point that there's a Greek VP that's a VP from basically a smaller state. So So stay tuned to that. Eventually, maybe we'll cover that. So one of the things that occurred post Georgia was, and this is not the first attempt, but amongst many, this concept of having a NATO a response force and battle groups and European battle groups. And this goes to our earlier conversation on what's European defense versus what's NATO defense. It almost always falls back to the smaller states or the newer states or the Eastern states or the Nordic states tend to take a position that NATO is their European defense. The French, generally speaking, don't. And I think this goes all the way back to the construction of NATO, really, in the late 40s and 50s, which I think most people don't fully appreciate, that the French were at best lukewarm, and to the point that they left, and then they came back, and then they came back with conditions, and then they've always been in this uncommitted state when it comes to NATO, and have always been attempting to construct some form of a European army. I mean, I'm not going to suggest it's strangely modeled after Napoleon's army, but at a certain point, when the French are the ones pushing this, and they've been doing it for for half a century or more, and there's a sense of Frenchness to the project, there seems to be somewhat of a cognitive dissonance going on there, I think would be the safe thing to say. And so the objective in the NATO response force, which, to be honest, at this point, the only NATO response force that existed that could be sizable was the United States, and the force that the United States would have in rotation in Europe, which tended to be a cavalry regiment, an airborne brigade, a special forces battalion, and then some sustainment brigades, and then some individual combat battalions that would be rotating through. That was, and then you could glue on a bunch of those sort of sister states. And that was primarily because of the NATO mission into Afghanistan. So the NATO missions into Afghanistan, in some ways, were critical for all of those smaller states and newer states in the East and in Northern Europe, and then ultimately Spain is probably the most surprising actor in what you might call old Europe or traditional Western Europe, in that they really engaged a different policy in security and military, and a lot of it came down to obviously the impacts of the terrorist attacks that happened in Spain, which were as substantial as the ones that happened in Belgium or France or the UK. And strangely, Italy really survived a lot of that over those last 15, 20 years. And from most understanding is they were able to thwart most of those. But I think a lot of that comes down to the Italians have a different relationship with their police forces. One that if you are used to a large American city, you might have more of an understanding of, which is there's much more of a traditional crime suppression approach in Italy. So that, I think, was a big party to how they thwarted a lot of those terrorist activities. I'm not making a judgment if those are the appropriate ways you should use your police, but that was a big impact in terms of Italian politics and their support for NATO. But that's changed. I mean, and we'll get into that in the future. But so this NATO response force, the objective was to be able to have these 6-month rotations. So it was sort of a response to the European army, because as the French push a European army, NATO tends to, it's like they're playing tennis with each other. NATO tends to sort of serve the ball back and sort of upgrade the European army attempt, which so far has never produced anything more than the individual components, primarily French, that have been associated with it. But so this NATO response force was supposed to be 25,000 able to deploy in 5 days, which, to be very honest, was never feasible. You know, the U.S. is probably the only expeditionary force in the world that has the ability to deploy that many in 5 days, with all the sustainment that you need. And the U.S. could barely do that, to be very honest. I mean, it's people have a sense of how easy these things are because you have lots of bases, lots of planes, lots of ships. It's a big difference once you start looking at fully prepared deployable units that are on standby with all of the sustainment they need and readiness, and all of their combat efficiency up to the appropriate level, typically over 90%. You tend to, that tends to be a pretty hard and big ask. At this, and then also there's other pieces here, like making sure there's a naval task force with a carrier battle group, an air component, which, you know, so at a certain point, what you're saying is have a mini US that you're throwing on out of thin air, or basically have Britain, create another Britain. And so what basically happened is, and this is something fascinating during this period, is the Brits viewed this as an opportunity. And so what they did is they basically constructed the NATO response force, which became mostly a British response, you know, a British. So in a weird way, the British NATO response force was a counter, of course, you know, everyone's still fighting 14-15 to the French European, you know, army. And that's sort of where we are to this day. And if you look at the Ukrainian conflict, it's one of the reasons that that the UK has been able to offer so much support to Ukraine is they've had this infrastructure in place for well over a decade.
Yeah, I think a key point to sort of clarify for those of our listeners, if you want 25,000 soldiers in a destination and you want them to be able to deploy, the entire amount of sustenance that you need to provide in terms of tactical logistics, food, medical, weapons,
everything.
Yeah.
And then in the modern world, with all the multi-domain nature, you need air contestation, air support, air defense. I mean,
so we're usually talking about 4 to 5 people for every person.
That's right. That's right. And so, you know, very, and we're looking at this hyper fragmented European Union. And to be very honest, in going into this conflict, hyper fragmented NATO in many ways. So one thing to recognize is that the US posture in Europe has been pretty consistent post-Cold War. There's been a couple of, obviously, in the 90s there were drawdowns. So what I would say is pretty consistent post-1998. I think the war in Yugoslavia and the NATO war in Kosovo transformed NATO in terms of the U.S. posture in Europe, in the European theater the last 25 years. Now, a big part of that became deployability in the beginning into Iraq, but then later into Afghanistan. But over time, especially with various Russian actions in Eastern Europe and in the Baltics, the U.S. posture augmented over time for Europe specifically. So this is there's a brigade combat team that's been maintained in both Germany and in Italy, and then there's additional. There were additional combat teams in Germany until 2012 and 13, and you're seeing now today. So I'm bringing both these together just to a little bit, to a small degree, is that Poland is acting or trying to act as the sort of new Germany, if you can think of West Germany from a Cold War perspective, where they're going to be this sort of depot, this buttressing of the of the eastern flank, from a security perspective. And and so when you look at some of these numbers, like, oh, there's 77 bases, yeah, for the Air Force, but you have to realize a lot of these are extremely small, old, or multi-use at this point, right? They're private air, there's a lot of small private airports all over the world, but in Europe there's an enormous amount, and there's a enormous amount of these, and most of these are those countries' main Air Force air bases that the U.S. will have a small select group of aircraft. Most of them not combat aircraft either. They might be transportation and logistics, or they might be refueling, or they might be surveillance. And then, as you can see, there's always been, very heavy concentration of air bases in the UK, and in Italy, it's always been Aviano, and then in Germany, obviously Ramstein. So, and then the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, and ultimately, the most interesting aspect of, I'd say, the evolution of NATO now is going to be in its commitment to aircraft, because NATO has had a shift by all these states to modernize their aircraft, and this was happening far before this conflict in Ukraine with Russia. This was happening 15, 20 years ago, really 25 years ago, with the concept of the Eurofighter, which fell apart. And now there's there's like two mini Eurofighters now. There's a French one, and of course there's the British one, and they're both likely to get built because they both have strong defense industries. And then the U.S., of course, is selling the F-35, kind of like hotcakes because it's available. And it looks like the next generation British fighter will probably be available by the end of this decade into the 2030s. And then the next generation French fighter, probably not till the end of the 2030s, realistically, into the 2040s. So it might not really succeed, if we're going to be honest about it. I mean, the French will buy it, obviously, and then a few other states that will not want to lose favor with the French. But you're going to see a substantial modernization across the European air defense this decade. I mean, I could see huge numbers. I mean, 500 plus fighters, an additional maybe 500 other aircraft, and then obviously tons of air defense and missile defense. So I think that's going to be a massive shift in posture. And then there's an interesting dynamic going on with European and NATO and forces at sea, because the mission for NATO at sea is very unique, especially how it's evolved, right? It has a migration component, security, border, transnational crime, et cetera. And then acting as a small response force to larger conflicts within the region. And this separates itself from what the Brits and what the French do, right? Because the Brits and the French have a unique naval capability, right? So the Brits specifically have always maintained a nuclear capable Navy, especially their subsurface force, primarily because it offers, from a game theory standpoint, the ultimate in a retaliatory framework, because no matter what you do to strike Great Britain, if it was Russia or China, or the US, I mean, I doubt the US is launching a retaliatory nuclear strike on the UK. I mean, that's something in Kings and Generals, maybe, but because those subs are still out there and would be able to launch a retaliatory strike. So it gives the UK a very low cost, non-nuclear triad, and it gives it its similar effects. And then the French and the Brits have been attempting for decades to sustain aircraft carriers, which are pretty hard to sustain. So I think the goal is they can have one real carrier and then maybe like half a dozen smaller fleet carriers. The Spanish, strangely, have become sort of medium-sized ship superpower builder, very much like the South Koreans. And they're building like hotcakes, these almost these multi-purpose, like baby flight deck destroyer carriers, right? They can have 8, 10, 12 helicopters. They can have 4 or 5 jets. They can have oddball little sets of small boats and ships. They can deploy expeditionary forces, have 500 soldiers on there, whatever, Marines. So they're great for humanitarian aid. They're kind of great as an export vehicle for them. And I could see those littering Europe over the next 10, 20 years, because they all come in pretty much under $1 billion, and with purchasing power, now euro and the dollar pretty much being equal, I think those will sell like hotcakes. So, so you could see this evolution of NATO and European security through modern technology. And obviously cyber defense and cybersecurity information war is I actually think Europe's going to become a superpower in this, primarily because the information war fits their economic, social, political cohesion and expeditionary nature with that anyways. And cybersecurity and digital fits their evolution that they're attempting to have with modern digital technology. So I actually think that's going to be a big part of their future defense. And I would say almost offensive capability, as much as that can be offensive.
Do you feel like that's going to be the newer states bringing the older states along? Because Estonia, for example, has a huge cyber capability, whereas Italy's really not known for that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, I think what you're going to see is funky combinations, would be the way I would put it. Tie-ups that you wouldn't necessarily think are going to be the ones that make sense, but they're going to work because of whatever the politics are at that moment. So yeah, someone like Estonia, well, and Estonia has been able to sort of export that in its region, right? Its greater region to the Nordics, to the Baltics, to Ukraine now, to Poland, and now across the Visegrad, exactly, Visegrad, V4 countries, even Hungary, even though Hungary is kind of different right now, they're still participating in kind of individual piece parts. So I could see that block, that newer block, as a sort of digital cyber sort of superpower amongst the larger European security, and then the French, Italians, Spanish playing catch up. I think the Germans will always have a struggle with this, especially this, because this falls into the whole information domain, data domain, and going all the way back to obviously its history, World War II, et cetera, collecting information on people, et cetera. I think the Germans will be extremely surgical and selective about these capabilities because of the domestic politics in that. But I could see almost any other country in Europe over the next decade. And this is, to be honest, I think one of the cheapest paths. It's a good employment act. It gets young people involved. There's a recycling aspect to this in their economy, right? Most people who join any military in the world who does this, I'd say at least 3/4 don't stay after their first 1 or 2 terms, so 5 years, 7 years, and then they're in the economy. And then that boosts your IT and your technology industries. So I see that as a fundamental shift. And I would also say within the EU, there is a larger prioritization now on rule of law, democracy, and the behaviors in modern democracies. And I think the information war is going to be a big part of that also. And so I see those as sort of, those two with the Air Force, air defense, and, sort of around the edges, their sea power being sort of the dominant push of European security over the next 10, 20 years, especially vis-a-vis Russia. And sort of indirectly other actors, whoever those other actors are.
Yeah, I was going to say Incirlik is very famous in the Middle Eastern region because that's usually the NATO's point of projection.
That's right.
For example, the Iraq campaign or the Afghanistan campaign. And so that is one of the reasons
and
why
Kurdish and Kurdish support, obviously.
Yeah,
obviously.
So it results in.
I was stationed there, so I know that area pretty well, and this is that strange dynamic between Turkey, NATO, Europe, which clearly this generation of leaders aren't able to square very effectively. But I think as you get into another generation of leaders, that's going to change. One thing interesting about NATO that I think most parties don't give enough credit to is NATO's ability to survive whatever the other domestic crises that might be going on. There was a real coup attempt in Turkey, in the last 5 years. And I'm saying that because there was this kind of Monty Python version in Germany in the last few weeks. If anyone has paid attention to that.
Well, I think you and I might have a disagreement about how real the coup was in Turkey, but.
Well, okay. Well, no, but what I'm trying to say is that there was the mechanisms of coupping, that would be what I would point out, were very real.
Yes.
Right. You had
tanks in the streets.
You had tanks in the streets, you had army brigades and colonels of different forces switching sides back and forth. You had the protection of your leadership, the makings of a coup, versus, like I said, this is sort of weird Monty Python thing the last few weeks in Germany, with some 75-year-old princes and 80-year-old plumbers and some other stuff. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that NATO operates, it keeps smoothly operating while all these crises can go on in these countries, political crisis. In some ways, it was sort of designed around European politics, which, if you look at I think the average, I'm trying to get the number right. I think the average is 0.91 Italian governments per year. Literally, I think it's 73 governments in 80, what is that now? 80 or 76 years, right?
Yeah, since 46.
Yeah, 77 years, I guess. We're in 77 years. So 73 into 77, whatever that is, 0.97 or something. So, and you had to keep doing things while that was going on, or else, you wouldn't have a security alliance. So there is a resilience there that is built in, and it's built in through the cadres. It's built in through the political leadership that exists in NATO. Most people don't understand that there is a strange round robin going on in between NATO and the EU and those individual countries. You'll have officers and defense ministry type people, foreign policy people, security people that are rotating between all these institutions. And so there's almost a muscle memory that's being constructed between them. And it's one of the reasons why there can be friction in policy, and there tends to only be friction in policy, but there doesn't tend to be a lot of friction between the actors, especially the operational actors. There tends to be friction from outsiders, new politicians, people who don't have any experience in this, sort of randos that just got elected. They tend to learn pretty quickly. They tend to get read in and kind of adult up pretty quickly.
Yeah, there's that division between the political individuals who are elected and re-elected on a near constant basis, and the institutional individuals
That's
who've
exactly
been
right.
doing this for 25 years and have
Yeah.
that sort of understanding.
Yeah, and a great example of that would be Hungary, right? I mean, you have Hungarian officers that are, by most concepts normal and operating in normal form, and then you have a government that, could be bomb throwing on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, towards European institutions or towards other states or towards themselves, whatever, and the two in some ways shall not meet.
Looking at this map, I actually have a few questions. The first
Sure.
one comes from the comments here, and it's basically, can you talk about why there would be so many nuclear weapons in Europe? And then conversely, my sort of question looking at this map, I always hear conversations about the United States putting nuclear weapons in Poland and Hungary and other places that are closer to Russia, and Russia's pushing back on that diplomatically. So why does that map not show these kinds of Eastern European positions?
Yeah, so a couple things is, because there's a base that can be a nuclear air base, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are nuclear weapons on that base. Part of what, in essence, part of what modern air nuclear theory has taught the world in the last 30, 40 years. And the Chinese have become sort of masters at, or becoming masters at this, and the US and the UK and the French, obviously, and their allies, have leveraged this also for 50 plus years in game theory, is that if you don't know where those weapons are going to be, then that's going to be a deterrent, because you don't know where the response is going to be. And so that has always been part of that posture for air-based nuclear weapons, whereas ground-based weapons have tended to be fixed. Now, the Chinese have sort of implemented a novel strategy on this, where, because they're Chinese, so they roll big. They've built like 100 silos, and the best guess is somewhere between 1 and 11 are, basically filled at any point in time, to the point that's like a whack-a-mole game, basically, right? And so, which is sort of a genius strategy. It's sort of like taking this air strategy and just, taking it up on a game board to the 10. And so a big part of this air-based strategy is that when during the 60s and 70s, there was a very large movement to and into the 80s to get nuclear weapons out of Western European states. The focus primarily was on ground-based nuclear weapons. It was almost exclusively on ground-based nuclear weapons. And there was a shift in nuclear theory anyways, that the triad was viewed more as that large-scale strategic strikes would occur from ground-based systems, and tactical mid-range strikes would occur from air-based systems, and then sea-based systems which are submarines basically, would be the final aspect to the triad. And so these are bases that can support a nuclear bomber, because that's where nuclear weapons come from. So the US is really the only force in the world at this point, next to the Russians, who maintain large-scale strategic bombers for either conventional or nuclear capability. And the definition of that is being able to fly continuously, 24 hours with permanent refueling, and et cetera. And so these bases support the ability to have those type of bombers, which are, they have special considerations and needs that they have for maintenance, fuel, support, mission, et cetera, storage, security. The whole 9 yards. So that's the next slide. Yeah. All right. And now missile defense is going to be, I think, a very unique shift that's going to happen in Europe pretty dramatically. The old conversation used to be, which is why there wasn't much focus on it in Europe, because Europe was really the cornerstone negotiator for really Iran into any party-based deals. And they've always felt like that was their sort of capital or their equity in the deal, that the Iranians wouldn't strike a partner like the Europeans. And so, and they always took the threat from Russia as not really much of a threat. Obviously, with the standoff strikes across Ukraine that we've been seeing, and I think the best estimate is over 1,000. So this is forcing a massive reevaluation of missile defense across Europe, and I believe there will be a substantial shift in missile defense in Europe, and that will be a big outcome to this conflict, basically.
Can you sort of walk through why this particular missile defense wouldn't work with the new Iranian positions within Russia, let's say?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the Iranian-Russian tie-up, which is so new, and also what I would say is it's so novel that there's no one that's an expert in this, right? Like anyone who says they are, like, okay, where's your 3 books and 50 papers, right? It doesn't exist. I mean, nobody saw this type of relationship developing, right? I mean, it would be the equivalent of of the Chinese and Pakistanis developing a hard power relationship, right, against India and anyone else they wanted to, right? Like, it would just be out of left field, and it looks like this relationship is pretty substantial in its depth, because you're looking at, I would say, it's got to be the 5 most important offensive capabilities that Iran has, which are mid, short range missiles and a whole suite of drones, and to the point of drone production being co-developed. When you look at at what was viewed as the threat in the 2000s, and I would say would be the traditional threat, which would be an intercontinental ballistic missile, whether medium or long range. And then you would have basically an exo-atmospheric intercept. I mean, that's sort of the large scale strategic missile defense model versus the more medium short range, which is it's different in terms of its complexity. The technology is easier, but the response times are infinitesimal, right? Because you're dealing with low atmospheric launches at a very, very short pace of 50, 100 kilometers away, or even shorter. So your ability to respond is radically different. You actually, the modern way that most are responding to this is putting up basically these think of them as almost steel chain guns that are launching like a steel thread, or a set of those. You'd have 4, 6, or 8 of them, and then radars that are trying to control them, and then you basically try to litter that airspace as that missile or set of drones are coming down through it, and then they basically get damaged and destroyed. And that requires an enormous amount of resources, training, development. It's very, very, very labor intensive. And that's a radically different threat than intercontinental. Also, the whole deterrence model is different, because an intercontinental threat forces a different type of deterrence. I mean, in terms of response. Whereas a very short range threat, the concept of proportional doctrine kicks in. And so then you start asking questions of like, well, and this is where the Ukrainians are right now, which is, well, are we able to strike those individual bases, regardless of the territory they're on, that those actual threats are coming from? And we've seen a few of those happen in the last maybe few months, maybe 5 or whatever, that the Ukrainians have responded to. And that seems to not have shifted the proportionality of response by the Russians, right? You know, everybody talking 3-6 months ago about the Russians were going to, you know, like loose nuke talk, you know, which was arguably a substantial mistake by the Russians, because they're one of their biggest partners, the Chinese, do not need any loose nuke talks, primarily because the Chinese have such an enormous imbalance when it comes to strategic weapons to the United States, that I would argue their biggest threat in all of the Indo-Pacific is a ballistic missile shield. And any even remote hint or whiff of any kind of tactical nuclear or any kind of large scale intercontinental launches, and a full-blown missile shield goes up across all allies of the Pacific against the Indo-Pacific against the Chinese.
But I think it's even more than that. I would say that from a Russian ideological standpoint, the idea of suffering for the is far more substantiated by Russian culture than in China. The idea
that's
of
fair
materialistic benefit is what is the guiding principle,
the modern guiding principle, especially
of the Chinese government. So if China becomes a nuclear wasteland, that sort of
it defeats that too. And also, you know, the Chinese have this very interesting ability to have a, you know, superpower of domestic defense, but it's not really expeditionary, even though it has sort of a little bit of a tinge of that, but then pivoting into almost their version of a European style social, political, economic projection of power, right? So they've sort of, you know, that's their Rubik's Cube. Loose nuke talk isn't good for either one of those. You know, it's just it's
bad for business.
It's bad for business on all fronts. But I would say this shift, given you know, the scale, and we can't like I said, we can't underestimate the scale where the Russians have launched at least 1,000 ballistic missiles at Ukraine. You know, and maybe when it's all said and done, it's going to be thousands. You know, that's a you know, this is a big test case. And I think you're going to see, especially in the East and the Nordics, through most of Central Europe, I mean, a massive ballistic, you know, a defense shield that's going to go up. And then at some point, that's going to wind up, you know, shifting into other regions. So, you know, so one of the objectives back then was so one of the objectives back in the 2000s is that there was under the Bush administration objective to have this missile defense shield to prevent Iranian launches, which obviously the European shift was strategic in that they became the dominant negotiating actor. And I'd say the Obama pivot, President Obama's pivot, was to take a more adaptive model, which really made a lot of sense. It was, or let's put it this way, it was more realistic, it was more actionable, and it leveraged in already in place capabilities, already proven capabilities. And so for those of you that aren't aware, there's a concept called Aegis, which think of it as prior to the Israeli concept of an Iron Dome. This was ballistic missile defense capability, or all missile defense capability that the US Navy has developed the last 40, 50 years to protect its aircraft carriers. And so around a large carrier, you'll have an Aegis shield being developed and integrated across, at this point, usually a dozen or up to maybe 24 ships, which will provide a full like spectrum, missile defense against threats coming in against that carrier. And so Aegis is now, really it's sort of like off the shelf. It's the equivalent in the missile defense world of like an AK-47. I mean, it's something that is extremely available to partners and to U.S. partners, NATO partners, and to and non-partners even at that, like the Japanese.
So what's the functional difference between an Aegis and, let's say, a Patriot missile that people might be?
Well, okay, so a Patriot is a ground-based system. But what's interesting is Aegis is being adaptive to the ground now. But the big difference is that in the ocean, because of the way the ocean represents extremely, it's 5D chess, you have threats that can come from a lot of different platforms and ranges and sort of systems. And so what Aegis does is it integrates and automates a huge amount of the response based on the threat. So if there is a low flying, Exocet missile, well, that came from somewhere, right? It didn't fall out of an alien chute. So Aegis will pick up on it. It will pick up on where its source came from. It'll pick up on all other instrumentation around it. It'll defeat that as a threat. It will then go out and seek, or at least pre-position, what other threats might be. And it will also integrate into the command and control, not in some Skynet automated way, but in terms of sort of like a heuristic, where that fleet will now, as it conducts its evasive maneuvers, it will conduct it with an Aegis set of umbrellas. So it won't just be one umbrella, it'll be lots of different umbrellas. Patriots, which the way they were constructed, which the Israelis sort of have hacked, like the way the Ukrainians have hacked everything, right? The Ukrainians are taking, turntables and turning them into drones. But the Israelis took Patriot systems and basically did their version of like an Aegis on the ground. And now they've done a version of that in the air, and they're doing one at sea, and they're doing a digital one. And now they're helping the Ukrainians. Basically, it's like dome as a service, so to speak, like throwing a little cloud play in this. And so the advantage to this approach that the US was taking, or the Obama administration was taking, is that it was leveraging existing sites that the US had already established for, let's say, older missile defense capabilities in Romania and Poland, and then upgrading them. And once again, these are defensive systems the US put in also. So it form fitted to NATO, and that these weren't offensive systems. So the offensive systems, the ships were offensive systems. The ships are, in some ways, don't know how not to be. But the ground-based systems can be, based on the missile type, are set up to basically be purely defensive. And then there were extra radars. So radaring is huge to this whole concept, right? It's like we get kind of thought captured on the missile or on the, on the thing that goes boom. But the radar, command and control, all of the communication integration and control systems are really the brains to all of this. And so this was let's just say this was smart policy. And in some ways, what Europe's building on now are these decisions that were made, in the last decade, basically. I would say this is probably one of the cheapest and smarter things that's happened, and that isn't really talked about much. So there is an elementary missile defense, but there's going to be a muscular, robust one going forward, because we're talking the scale of attacks. I mean, 1,000 missiles launched at a country in 2022 is a pretty substantial ballistic attack historically. You have to go back to, I mean, I don't even think, I don't know if Gulf War One had that many. I don't know if Gulf War One even had that many. I think you might have to go back to like World War II, the V1, V2s. I mean, it's literally that large of a ballistic attack going on a country right now. So
now,
yep.
I have a question, and from the audience here.
Yep.
Apparently, the UK built two new large aircraft carriers that cost billions of dollars, but don't have the planes that can effectively use them. Is that the case?
I mean, it's the case minus. So the aircraft are going to become a mix of F-35s, right? So which will be the same ones the U.S. Navy uses. So there's one of those two carriers is fully integrated into into the UK Navy, NATO, and into the Indo-Pacific Command, what used to be the SINCPAC Command. And they've actually gone on exercises. Actually, the first exercise since World War II that planes that took off from one carrier landed on another carrier back and forth. So between the US and the Brits and the UK landed F-35s and F-18s on each other's carriers. So one of those two carriers is fully operational. The other one will be, and I think if I'm a betting person, on this, the UK is going to basically split those carriers between the Indo-Pacific and Europe, especially now given the threat, and then as an additional European, French basically carrier comes online, and this is where the Spanish and Italians, like I said, I mentioned this earlier, but the Italians build these sort of mini or baby carriers. Just like the Spanish do, and I think a lot of smaller states are going to acquire those in Europe, and so I can see that as a larger part of their force projection, basically. So there's as I mentioned earlier, we don't have to really spend a lot of time here, but that the U.S. has had obviously at the end of the Cold War and then through the 90s and then even into the 2000s, there was a substantial reduction in forces across Europe. I would say in terms of combat power, at least 60%, maybe 70%. And this is in the post-Cold War era, not even compared to the Cold War era. Cold War era, it's more like 80, 90%. But that's changing, obviously, with what's going on right now. And the U.S. is deploying more as the other countries are modernizing at the same time. And I'll do in my next presentation, I'm going to do a breakdown of that modernization across or the status of those different countries' forces, and then a breakdown of how they're sort of evolving. The next slide, real quick. Yeah, so the EU, and especially if you throw it on a sort of a purchasing power basis, that 260 billion in 2009 was more like 330 billion, especially because there's a lot of those Eastern and Central European states. They have a greater purchasing power and an enormous part of the military that's labor-based or that's domestic production-based. Obviously, the purchasing power is a big deal. So at this point, the Germans, that was a Freudian slip. The Chinese are ahead of the European in terms of spending, but it's pretty close because these numbers, and you'll see in a future presentation, Europe has sort of bumped these numbers up by about 50%, really, in the last 13, 14 years. But, this masks something very fundamental, which is there's absolutely no integration except for NATO and a small amount around the edges, the Nordics, the Baltics, Poland, and is trying to act in some ways as this, in a strange way, as the West Germany of the modern era when it comes to defense and security. They're trying to bring, let's call it the coalition of the willing. That was a joke. Of Nordic and Baltic and Central European states to become more integrated, and they're doing it within NATO and sort of a NATO adjacent. And in some ways they're not necessarily asking for permission from the EU, because the EU doesn't really have a lot of mechanisms to grant that permission either.
I was going to say, to what degree do you feel like this is Poland trying to reclaim some sort of historic legacy of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth?
Yeah.
And to what degree do you see this as a direct reaction to the post-Soviet climate?
I mean, I think, like in every country on earth in general, there is always some group, however Monty Python-ish or serious, that has a revanchist or irredentist or sort of historicalism around their creation myth and or their central purpose. So that's always out there. But I think in terms of sort of cold hard facts, the Poles have felt fundamentally threatened over the last 30 years. Especially because most of what they've been trying to do is encourage, especially the large European actors, the French and the Germans, to take the Russian threat seriously, and the EU for that matter. And really the only party that ever did take that seriously was the UK and the rest of those regional actors in the East. And so I think this in some ways is Poland acting as the larger sum of the parties, right? They have the largest state in that region, so they can host the largest amount of forces or of security arrangements, training, and that's what this comes down to always, right? I mean, this stuff isn't just stuff you buy and put in a warehouse. I mean, it's you need, bases, you need training grounds, you need area commands, you need air bases. I mean, it's just, it starts adding up in terms of the amount of physical resources and infrastructure you need. So it's pretty hard for Lithuania to be able to support all this. It's hard for Ukraine to support all this because they're in the middle of a war and they're not a party to either being in the EU or NATO yet. So Poland is sort of the most rational party in this whole setup at this point, and they've sort of stepped up into this void. And the Germans, in some ways, have not known how to respond to this. It's sort of ham-fisted, and that's a lot to do with sort of German politics, really, in the post-war era. And that was a construction of German identity in some ways, was to kind of play all sides against the middle and compromise until, problem X isn't defined as a problem, not because it's not a problem, but because nobody defines it that way anymore. And we're moved on to something else. Some things you can't do that very effectively with. And I think Russian invasion of Ukraine with 1,000 ballistic missiles fired at it makes that a harder problem to do that with. And so as the Germans are struggling, and the struggle is astronomical because this struggle is really 35 years in the making. All right. I mean, they're not going to turn around the Bundeswehr and sort of German defense and security I don't think in any meaningful way this decade. I mean, it's going to take them a very long time. I mean, they basically went into a large scale disarmament starting in the mid 80s, and haven't stopped, to the point that the present defense minister, who has openly said she never wanted to be a defense minister, wanted to be the interior minister. This was before the Ukrainian invasion and after, which I don't know how that works, but and you have, von der Leyen, who was the defense minister, always sort of forgets to talk about that part of it. And when she was in Germany, she was defense minister for, I think, 5 years. And, that's a mindset that Germans have to change. And while that's changing, the Poles don't want to wait, the Nordics don't want to wait, the Baltics don't want to wait, the rest of the Central Europeans don't, the Ukrainians aren't. And then I would even say other actors that weren't fully expecting, like the Italians, as different as the present government is from the prior government. One thing is that it is more pro-Ukrainian and more pro-European defense than the prior government was. And I don't think most people were expecting that out of whether they're somewhere between a center right and a far right, and kind of, I guess based on how much espresso people have had that day, but they are acting not in a traditional Western European way, and the Spanish aren't either. So there is this strange shift that's going on, and I would say even the Greeks. I think this, and it was very real for a very long time. There was this very strong Russian-Greek relationship going back, 200 years. And then I would say after World War II, through, communism and through the communist expansion into Europe, which had been very strong also. And then post-Cold War into, let's say, Russian oligarchism. Greece and Cyprus and places like that were able to take advantage of it. That's shifted. I mean, that's that's arguably as large of a shift that's happened in maybe anywhere in all of Europe, because who would have thought that the Greeks would shift this hard against the Russians, and given the distance the Greeks are from the Ukrainians. But it also speaks to this overriding nature that the Greeks have become in this social cohesion, economic, political cohesion system that's now Europe. They become a full actor.
Yeah, I wanted to take a second and sort of, underline that for the last 100 years or so, the Russian foreign policy situation has been an increasingly limited set of returns, where before they had a foothold in the Balkans, they had a foothold in Central Asia, they had a foothold Mediterranean in East Asia through their relationship with China. They had all these different relationships, and one by one, they're seeing those relationships being peeled off either by the United States, by Europe, by China, or through their inept actions in terms of how they manage the relationships as those colonies or proto-colonies or vassal states begin to become more independent, and Russia doesn't understand how to develop that relationship.
I listened to an interesting podcast that referenced this as a form of sort of an ideological imperialism, and it was a kind of a great way that they framed it, because there is a certain nature to that irredentishness that the Russians had, and clearly it was effective generationally until it isn't. And there's this sort of seismic line. It's almost like lots of things in life. When something becomes legacy, whatever it is, a car, a computer, your blender, whatever, it's gone, right? Like the way you reference it anymore, it's like it might have given you 20 great years. It doesn't even exist to you anymore. And in a strange way, that's happening. Now, it hasn't fully happened, but that's happening in parts of Europe that most people just would never have believed could happen at the scale. I would argue, I think probably the next shoe to drop in the next few years is going to be Hungary, Bulgaria. I mean, you already see it sort of with Bulgaria. They're not on the fence anymore, but they're not 100% pro-Ukraine, but they're close. But it's bigger than that, right? It's bigger than Ukraine. Ukraine's become a proxy for this. It's just a larger view, which is day to day, there's new generations of people who are saying, where's my future? My future is not with Russians. My future is with Europeanness. And I think that feeds itself into the belief in supporting European institutions. Now, where that line ends mostly is, I think, in the concept of military capacity. And we'll definitely in future presentations drill into this, but the Europeans have constructed, because they're really good at constructing, enormous amounts of pillars, directives, agencies. I always felt like that would be a cool job to have, would be like director of European naming of things, because they construct, what was called PESCO, which was a voluntary to binding on joint planning. I know a lot of this stuff gets opaque pretty quickly. And that's different than the Defense Fund, which was really a cross-border instrument to fund defense industries. Obviously, you could take a wild guess of who the biggest supporter of the EDF is, which is the French, because obviously they want to develop, their defense industry, which is fine. I mean, just like the US does and the UK does. And in a strange way, the Germans do. The Germans produce some of the best defense technologies in the world. They just don't buy them themselves. They buy literally almost none of them. And then the European Peace Facility, which is actually a pretty powerful facility. It's been developed over the last 20 years, where, especially in Africa, they've really leveraged this as a, in a strange way, almost like their own little micro IMF, but it's instrumented with their policy engagement, right? So as they engage different actors who are in conflict or a state that's in development, they can engineer resources, security, police, transnational crime, suppression, whatever, to support that state. It's actually a pretty efficient thing compared to, I would say, any other, whether it's the UN or whether it's sort of the traditional NGO world, which tends to be very fragmented. And what's powerful about the EPF is the NGOs tend to work with them even more than the UN now. And then the EDA is this sort of it's a weird cross between in the United States. There's a set of institutions like the National Defense University, basically places that study lots of activity, cooperation, processes. Theirs has a little more teeth, but it's really designed. And I think the thing we have to realize is, until this Ukrainian conflict occurred at the scale it did, most of the European security was focused completely on either counterterrorism, let's call it counter transnational crime. So, let's say more complex crime, stuff that is outside of normal national boundaries.
Yeah, like drug transmission, human trafficking.
Exactly. All that type of stuff. And then I would say small micro conflicts, frozen conflicts, gang type, large gang type conflicts that exist in different parts of the world that Europe was trying to engage in to sort of project its soft power. They're having to modernize all of this now, obviously, and that's a big point of friction, because the major actors are the Germans and the French. Obviously, the UK is out of the EU now. I would argue if the UK was in the EU, I think in weird ways this might even be worse, because the points of friction that have always existed between the UK and and French and Germans for this matter, really fundamentally, haven't really ever gone away. And the UK would wind up just acting because given the crisis going on, action is paramount right now, right? Not taking 4 years to construct the perfect agency
to assess the viability of the possibility of accumulating funding for development
of an actual agency, that would then eventually produce something and then buy something, and they get, so I think that's where there is this shift going on in power outside of France and Germany, and the French and the Germans are, I think, in some ways struggling to deal with that. And it's I think in the modern world, it's one of the first times that we've seen this, where French and German power isn't paramount. It used to be paramount because the French could control the mechanisms of international power for smaller states in Europe. They could make their lives miserable, and the Germans could do the same economically. Well, that's not quite true anymore, the same way as it was true in the past. And also actors in France and Germany, individual private actors, companies, organizations, just aren't as, let's say, committed to that state action in the same way as they were before. Before you could have more of a forced loyalty test, let's call it. Today, and a big part of it is these places are far more European, right? A company like Renault isn't made up of 100% French employees anymore. It's in terms of background from people, I'll bet less than 50-60% of the population working at Renault are French, mainland French for that matter, right? And so you just have a very different chessboard. It's much more dynamic, much more 4D kind of environment that the French and Germans, and especially the Germans, are just not built for this at all. They're built for a forced compromise. Like in some ways, it's almost like a coercive compromise.
Yeah, no, one of the things that you and I have talked about is that the defense coordination that's going on with Ukraine is existing in this sort of northwest to northeast to southeast L shape.
That's right.
In terms,
it's like a U around Germany and France, basically, and Belgium and Luxembourg, and so on, Portugal, etc. Yeah, that's exactly right. And
they're basically doing it to circumvent the French and German action.
That's right.
So it's almost the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah, it is. And I do think in some ways the bet on the French and the Germans' part has been that this conflict, it's sort of delusional, their bet, which was the Russians are going to win quickly, so it's over. Russians will win eventually. It'll be over. The Ukrainians will compromise, so their bet is always some other activity happening except a long war. And I think, as we've talked about in the past, and we'll do in early January, we'll do a full Ukrainian update as our next thing that we connect with, is that this obviously at that point is going on, 11 months. So it has all the hallmarks when you study conflicts, especially large-scale conflicts. It's falling into its mean and medium averages. That it's gearing towards a long war. Germany and France are not structured for a long war. It's really not, and I mean this politically, and especially as this sort of U is gearing up for this. And so I think there's a lot of there's a lot of power dynamics between Brussels, Paris, and Berlin now that are going to be forced to the front next year. I think next year and I think in the end, Brussels, Berlin, and Paris are going to compromise, but it won't be a full compromise. And it's gonna be a permanent pressure point between those, because it's gonna, in some ways, this is decades in the making. This monopoly of defense and security, and really ultimately overall power for the European Union, sort of triangulated between Paris, Brussels, and Berlin, and the rest of Europe, which is made up of
smaller states.
Yeah, of lots of other states. But when you look at it population wise, whether they're in the EU or adjacent to the EU, make up, almost 4/5 of the rest of the population in Europe, outside of the French, Germans and Brussels itself, because all of Belgium isn't quite Brussels either, even though it's a lot, I would say the politics of Belgium, the whole Benelux region. Netherlands is interesting. I think Netherlands is split between a more Nordic part of it, which is a minority, and a more German, French, Belgium, like, given historical, relationships. So that support is sort of sandwiched. But over time, I can see, even the Dutch, even the Netherlands, ultimately bending into this U, because a lot of their response to the last 20 years to conflict and to different threats has reshaped big parts of their society also. So, and then next slide, and we're almost done here. Yep, there we go. Any other questions? I know we covered a lot, and hopefully people got a lot out of this today, or at least got a good sense of different of the different challenges that Europe has structurally. And we keep talking about that. And one of the things I'm planning on doing going into next year is having ultimately 3 different series here. One that will be this defense one, and going into sort of country surveys. We'll cover the big countries first: Germany, France, Italy. We'll do a special breakout for the UK, even though they're not in the EU, but they're in NATO. And then I plan on covering sort of NATO and all those alliances, with the UK as sort of adjacent to the EU. And then we'll jump into a lot of the other regions: the Nordics, the Baltics, the V4, Southern Europe, etc. Benelux. And so that'll be one series. Another series is obviously the Ukrainian one, and I'm looking to try every 6 weeks to do a session on that. I want to keep this where it's focused on when there's a big shift, or some shift has happened, in the battle space or in the politics behind it. And then the third series, which will be a new series, and I'm going to try it. And if you guys like it, I'll do it. If you don't, then we'll do a one-off. I want to do a series on European energy and natural resources, politics, economics, because the industrial, natural resources, and energy underlying the European region, I argue, is sort of fundamental to its genesis, right? The coal and steel pact, the energy pacts that in the 40s, 50s, and 60s really governed a huge amount of the politics. And then if you look at the response to the oil embargoes in the 70s, so the shift into nuclear power that the French had, and Germans and others. And then the shift in Europe becoming incredibly industrialized, while it still used to do lots of raw material mining and engineering. And then it stopped doing that for lots of reasons, environmental, social, et cetera. But then it just became sort of an extractive importer. Well, given the change in sort of the threat matrix with the Chinese, and the Chinese becoming basically an extractive superpower, and US and Europeans choosing to not extract as much or very much as they used to.
Protect the environment, just don't protect it in China.
Yeah, exactly. And everywhere else in the world where, and so we're gonna, so my goal is to kind of get into that, because I believe that's a big part of the messy underbelly of all of this.
Yeah,
is understanding this realness of industrialness. So when people say, do X, it's like, okay, well, that means Y doesn't happen. And if Y doesn't happen, then Z means there are no jobs. And then people in Europe tend to do things with fire and pitchforks when there aren't a lot of jobs. And so, that's the real world. So that's, I'm going to try that early next year. So January, I'm looking to do, a bunch of sessions, and then, and that's it. So hopefully you guys will like it. If any other questions here? Or...
Yeah, I had a question. There's also a question in the chat. So one of those questions, and by the way, thank you everybody for all the kind comments. We really appreciate all the amazing things you've had to say, primarily about Aaron, but I happen to be pretty. So when we're talking,
his future wife thinks so too. Exactly.
So you've got the U, as you're calling it, the countries in the north, the countries in the east, the countries in the south that are bonding together over this defensive commitment that they're doing, and they're sort of pushing France and Germany in a diplomatic position towards the back.
And Brussels, I would say all three together, right? Because Brussels is its own little
microcosm.
Micro country almost.
Now, my worry, and I'm curious what you can expound on this, is how will this affect the enforcement of the Copenhagen criteria? Because we've seen, for example, with the Visegrad countries, especially Poland and Hungary, there's been a rebuke of these traditional norms of democratic institutions, of elected parliaments, of these kinds of things. So how do you think that's going to change?
Look, I think there is a multi-level shift in populism around the world. It's not unique to the United States, to Britain. We think it is because we dominate
media.
Yeah, and we dominate media, right? So our media matters, right? So the fact that a chair fell down and you tripped over it and it's on 15 social channels and replayed 500 million times meant that was more important than, a ship that capsized or whatever in the Mediterranean. But in the real world, it actually wasn't. And I think when we sort of accept the fact that there is a broader populism going on in the world, that these three sort of power zones, the Paris, Berlin, and Brussels, are going to bend, right? They're not going to break, but they're going to bend, because that's always been the history of and the EU and these three, this triangle, is incredibly resilient. I mean, it just is. There's no way to not see it that way. I mean, it can frustrate people, it can annoy people. It could be very sort of inflexible and sort of blind to lots of situations and opportunities, but they keep kind of just chugging along. And so as you see more of a populist bent occurring, whether left or right, across or even blended, because you could argue there was sort of a blended version in Italy at one point for a year, which I guess is an average government, right? So it's actually a pretty good government. It lasted a year. And sorry for any Italian friends out there. So I see this almost two-track model that's going to be developed, that when a populist, semi-populist, sort of populist on Wednesdays type government comes in, everyone's going to flip their playbook, and then they're going to do their normal things that they do for that, put people in timeout, get detention, take away play dates on Sundays. It's gonna be sort of a
scorched earth campaign.
Parental a campaign, which of course those actors know and expect, and there's this tennis that goes back and forth. And then I think over time, as these things sort of work their way out in each of these countries, because the thing we can't forget is that the things going on in these countries are domestic and real. I mean, we could say that, some magic actor is dropping in and making a place kooky for 10 years. I mean, the real world doesn't work like that, right? I mean, people support these regimes or these parties that are producing some of these state actions. At a certain point, a losing party figures out how to chip away at some of those messages and start sort of smoothing them to their side, whatever their side is. and that tends to dull those messages. That other party tends to cut a deal with the EU when they come in power, kind of like a backdoor thing, and then sort of the good times resume. That I see that type of or those type of miscegenations sort of happening as the constant, especially in that because I think there's something about the pressures, which is why they're responding to Ukraine differently than France or differently than Berlin, Paris, and Brussels are, because Berlin, Paris, and Brussels somewhat have a cocoon of each other, economically, socially, politically, within elite institutions, culturally. I mean, you name it.
And they've got a buffer with all those other states.
They have a buffer with the U, and the U feels it, and the U says, hey, what's up with that? And so that's where these points of friction. Now, I don't see that triangle fully compromising because they haven't compromised in 500 years. I don't see them going forward and compromising in a full sense and saying, we totally get it. We're going to start devolving our institutions, make them more local, have a more local EU for you, right? Now that rhymes, right? They're not going to do that. I mean, they might say, oh, by the way, the EU did its version of that by doing this really weird thing last year where they it was almost like a lottery of like a few thousand people all over the EU who got together on weekends and then kind of came up with a collective list of stuff they wanted the future of the EU to be. And then that, it was almost like it's Kumbaya project. I mean, I argue, okay, I guess better than nothing, but in the real world, what you would do is you would have standing offices in all these different locations. You'd have a far different parliamentary system that integrates. I mean, my argument is that you basically should have the senates of these individual states, the ones that have senates, they would submit their senates to the EU Parliament, and that would get you probably close to the 600, 800, 900 seats that you have anyways in the EU. And you kind of kill two birds with one stone. You have a lot more legitimacy. The EU is not doing any of that. I mean, that's just not who they are.
All right, so let's take a look at the other question.
Yeah.
So we've got these big, expensive aircraft carriers, and several countries have been trying to do them.
Someone did some aircraft carrier YouTube and Wikipedias.
So can you just sort of walk through whether aircraft carriers are still accessible and up to date, or whether drones that are exactly, or if they're viable, or whether drones, because of their cheapness, their size, will ultimately render them.
I mean, look, nobody has an aircraft carrier in the modern world without, as I was explaining earlier, these Aegis type defense and control systems are wrapped around them. So a drone is not getting through that at scale. It's just not. It's not happening. And I get it. There's video games. You send 500,000 little, flying cockroaches, and they all have their own little, it's really cool in a video game. In the real world, the energy requirements to get that across the middle of an ocean pretty much renders that not feasible, outside of whatever cool animation software people have. So aircraft carriers will still be viable as long as states want to project the kind of power that aircraft carriers have, which the kind of power aircraft carriers have is they give you a floating airbase, which allows you to conduct, especially now in the newer generation stealthy-ish type aircrafts, pretty robust first or counter strike capabilities, especially on what's called anti-radiation, basically things that are looking for other things, whether they're missiles, whether they're aircraft, whatever. And once you can render those weakened, then your larger campaigns can exist. And so, if the question really is, should Europe be building aircraft carriers? I think the Brits and the French will keep building them because they're a combination of something they know how to do, mostly.
And they're still both imperial powers.
And there's still, like small I, not quite with the AL imperial, power, right? It's not like the whole word's not there. Or they see themselves as that. And to be very honest, these smaller, almost knockoff versions from Spain and Italy haven't yet fully penetrated. I do argue, though, that they become more of the future. They become the smart future. That's like buying your Ring system for your, doorbell instead of some complicated $10,000 security system. That's what those ones are. I think once the Italians and the Spanish, South Koreans, which are, chugging away at those, Germans really get those cranking, I can see a lot more of those types of ships because they come in at, let's say 3 to 5 times less. There is still a place, I do think the Brits are unique in that they are outside the United States, the only power, at least in the West, not including the Chinese and the Russians, that have basically full spectrum capability. The French can have that if they want. They
haven't allocated the finances.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back and forth. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. It's not. It's more of a choice for them. But I think the UK maintains that for a big chunk of the 21st century until wherever we're going to end up in this sort of transformation in security and defense this next 20-30 years, which nobody knows. Anyone who says they do is delusional, because if someone told you 30 years ago this is where we'd be, I'd say, okay, give me all your stock market picks, right? We'd all be rich, right? So so I think the Brits are going to stay in that path, and they are anchoring very hard to NATO. I think the French are going to, at some point, my prediction is the French are going to make a new commitment to NATO at some point. It's not going to be in this set of administrations, but I think at some point there's going to be a newer generation of French leaders, and they're going to the math is going to dictate that. The finance is going to dictate that trying to sort of, do a French thing, a European thing, and a NATO thing just doesn't add up.
Well, thank you, Aaron.
Thank you
for the presentation, and thank you everybody for your questions. They've been very interesting, and the answers even more enlightening. So we look forward to talking again, hopefully on separate computers in different locations.
Yes.
You got something very exciting today.
Yes.
Where we're in the same place, but
as Richard's doing his marriage preparations here in northern New Jersey. So yeah.
So in that vein, thank you everybody for coming, and we're going to close out the session now. The session in January will probably be the weekend of the 15th. If not, then the 22nd. But wait on Meetup until we concretize that, and then you'll be able to see our upcoming event on Ukraine. So bye everybody.
Yep. All right. Thank you. Everyone have a great holiday and holidays, whatever you celebrate, and hopefully a great new year for everybody.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.